So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about one section of the course which I think is a really interesting and exciting piece of history. So if you can see there the colours of the French flag, the blue, the white and the red, the bleu, blanc, rouge, and it is these colours of the flag that represent the French Revolution and the idea of the Republic of France, the time that France actually decided to get rid of its monarchy. So why is this period so interesting? Well, I think it's interesting because no matter what your interest in history, the French Revolution has got something for everybody. So if you're interested in social history, the society of France at the time is a time of transition. It has long, for centuries, been a situation where the old regime, the first and second estates in society, the clergy and the nobility, have long exploited the people of the third estate, i.e. the vast majority of the population. And they've accepted it for generation upon generation. So why in this period that we are looking at do things start to change? Well, one of the reasons is because of the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution brings a new class to society. It brings the middle class. And the middle class have got wealth and power, and they look at those old estates and they're not happy with the idea of being exploited. Not only that, you've also got a working class that are increasingly literate. Because rather than just working the land, they are producing goods, and those goods need to be sold. They need to be recorded and weighed and written down in ledgers, and taxation of the people, of the goods that they're selling, also requires records to be kept. So for the first time you're starting to see a society that is becoming increasingly literate. So people are able to read, and therefore in society there are new ideas, and those ideas can circulate really quite easily. So the middle classes were educating their own children. The working class was starting to separate into manual workers and people who were skillful workers, and those skillful workers with their own businesses and so on themselves had to be able to read. So ideas circulate easily in this new France. Now, add into the mix a rather inexperienced, indecisive king, Louis XVI, who can't really decide which side to be on. Is he going to be on the side of the old regime, or is he going to be on the side of the new middle class and sort of recognise that times are changing? The most famous person in that royal family, though, isn't Louis. It's actually his wife, Marie Antoinette, age 15 when she becomes the Queen of France. Now, it is alleged, we will never really know whether she said this, but it tells us quite a lot about how people perceived her to be so out of touch with society. She was alleged to have said that if the starving peasants had no bread to eat, then it wasn't a problem, because surely they could eat cake instead. And it's that kind of dangerous inability to actually kind of calm the people down, to instill confidence, to manage his people through a time of change, that ultimately leads them to a situation where France and the French people are going to take matters into their own hands. So things don't change overnight. Today, the people of France celebrate as their most important national holiday. They celebrate the 14th of July, Bastille Day. So what happened on this particular day? Well, it perhaps wasn't really the most important element of the revolution. However, it was a hugely symbolic event. So on the 14th of July 1789, a very angry mob stormed the state prison, the Bastille in Paris, and freed various prisoners, the political prisoners, showing that really they would not give in to the power of the state, that the people actually were the state, the people had the power. This was a real sort of revolutionary event. Now, it didn't have a great effect, but the symbolism of it was really, really significant. And it was part of a chain of events. And there were a number of really key moments in this revolution. The time that Louis was forced to parade through his people wearing a red cap of liberty. The time that his title changes. He goes from being the king of France, the king of all he surveys, the king of all the land, to being the king of the French. The idea that he's their king, the idea that actually he serves them, all of those things are massively important symbolic gestures. Now, for a while, it is assumed that perhaps he can actually share power with his people. He can be a kind of constitutional monarch. He can share power with an assembly of ministers, with a group of elected people that the people of France have actually sort of decided would best represent them. However, Louis cannot stop wanting to be the absolute monarch, wanting to be the king that he once was, the one that he was so ineffective at being. And in the end, it becomes apparent that Louis is rather a dangerous character to have around. He's got too many friends abroad, and yet he's very ineffective as a king. And what happens to him is that he loses his head to Madame la Guillotine. And you can see the guillotine on the screen. It is a device that is meant to kind of take people's heads off very efficiently. And it's a real symbol to us today of the French Revolution. Now, it doesn't just affect the people of France, it affects the rest of Europe as well, because the events of this revolution are truly, truly shocking. A king has been beheaded. There has been a regicide. Unthinkable. A king is meant to be ordained by God. He's meant to be God's representative on earth. It's generally the idea. The divine right of kings is a very, very long established principle in most Christian societies. And here is one who has been killed. So could other monarchies now find themselves at risk? The monarchies of Europe were very much interconnected. They married into each other. They sort of, they made alliances through marriage. So these are cousins and uncles and aunts, and ultimately none of them feel particularly safe at this point. Also, it's based on a new order, this new France. Liberty, freedom, brotherhood, all people equal, equality. How can a society that has been founded on a very firm class system now find itself having completely turned that on its head and, given into the idea of the people being the major political force? And again, across in Britain, in other parts of Europe, you're finding the upper classes deciding that perhaps they're not as secure as they once were. Everyone's going through an industrial revolution. It isn't just France. And therefore, could these ideas be circulating in Britain? Could these ideas be circulating across Europe? So a very, very, very shocking thing has happened. But of course, there is also the problem of what's happening in France and what will happen in France, because actually historians will tell you that when there is a revolution, when there is a sudden removal of a powerful figure at the head of a country, what we find is that there is usually a power vacuum, a hole that is left, and maybe people have a leader, a structure in place that is going to sort of seamlessly take over, but usually not. Usually there are lots of people clamouring for power, fighting each other for power, with many different ideas about what this new society should look like. And that's exactly what happened in France. So it's a time of enormous change, a time when there are many different divisions in society, people sort of fighting each other, trying to force their way into taking control, and eventually there emerges a figure who perhaps can calm France down, and that figure is Robespierre. Now, Robespierre is an interesting character because as an individual, he seemed before taking power that he really kind of embodied this spirit of the revolution: fraternity, freedom, peace, equality. Once in power, he starts to change, mainly because the structures in France are so shaky, the divisions in France are so deep, and the undercurrent of violence and disorder is so threatening that even Robespierre decides that he has to kind of put on a show of strength, a show of power to try and quell the people into submission, to try and make them stop and think, and generally to try and bring order to the chaos. Now, unfortunately, he does unleash something that became known as the terror on the people of France. So fearful of continuous uprising was Robespierre that he had to really kind of sort of fight violence with violence, and that is really his undoing. Now, Robespierre became very unpopular, and he didn't really manage to quell the divisions in France, rather he made them worse. And he set up a tribunal to try and root out people who could be accused of being unrevolutionary, who could be accused of going against the spirit of the revolution. And these people could find themselves actually tried very easily by this tribunal with no real legal process, and could find themselves in the most appalling situation. Now, it's a bit of poetic justice that Robespierre ended up condemned by this very tribunal that he'd set up. And what was his fate? The guillotine. So poor old Robespierre ended up with the same fate as Louis XVI. Now, of course, a society in chaos starts to crave a little bit of leadership and strength. And very soon the people decided that what they really needed was a strong leader. A leader who had shown that they had military strength, a leader who had shown that he could actually sort of tame a population of uprising. And along comes Napoleon. Now, Napoleon himself was somebody who had actually been to university, he'd studied military tactics, and he was a really gifted military commander. He had been enormously successful in various campaigns on behalf of France. He came from Sardinia, so technically today we would think of him as Italian, although Sardinia was connected to France at that point. And very quickly he becomes quite a popular character. Now, some of the changes he made when he first came into power were really very beneficial to the French people. He does bring order to the chaos. He does actually appoint people based on meritocracy. He really does care that actually the best people to do a particular job are the people who are most qualified to do the job, the ones who have shown they have talent, not because they're somebody's son, not because they are born into a high-ranking family, not because they have positions because they're wealthy, but because they have it on merit. Now, this is a massive change in French society and a hugely beneficial one. The other thing that he does is he streamlines the French legal system. Now, the one that was inherited from before the revolution was absolutely the most chaotic piece of constitutional, I don't know what you would call it really, a kind of a complex system with lots of contradictions. So, for example, taxation could be raised at various points in the country at different rates. If you bought something, it had different measures and different values at different points in the country. So things were very, very chaotic. Laws had been added at various points in the revolution. And as they came out of that kind of period, you realise that France has actually got a very, very complex legal system with a range of laws that actually nobody really understands. And Napoleon spent quite a lot of time really simplifying and codifying that complex legal system. Again, mostly beneficial to the people of France. There were some exceptions. The problem with Napoleon is he come to power because of his popularity as a military commander. And he became convinced that that's what he needed to do to carry on being popular with the people. And it is this overgrown confidence in his abilities as a military commander which leads him to make some very costly mistakes. So his military power really and his military reputation starts to take a bit of a beating. It isn't just that, though, that makes him unpopular with the French people. It is what he has made himself appear. Now, at the beginning, we said that he started out by really truly believing in this concept of meritocracy. However, Napoleon over time has made himself into the emperor, and then the emperor for life, and then he has made a situation where actually, not only is he the emperor for life, but that title will be inherited by his son. So effectively what he has done is brought France full circle and given them another, albeit by a different name, emperor rather than king. He's given them another monarchy. And it is this ultimately, alongside the military disasters, that actually makes Napoleon very unpopular, and it becomes clear that he has to go. Now, Napoleon doesn't go quietly. So he doesn't share the same fate. He doesn't end up under the guillotine. However, he does end up in exile. The first time in a very pleasant place. He ends up in the Mediterranean island of Elba. However, he won't stay there, and he tries to come back and stage another coup, a takeover, to try and put himself back into power. And eventually he's defeated, and this time there is no such pleasant island for him. He is shipped off to St. Helena in the Atlantic, much more difficult for him to come back from, and there he will spend his last days, and he will die a defeated man. He will die in exile, having lost everything that he had built up. So that really would be the point at which the course ends. So it's an interesting course. It takes you right, really sort of full circle, and it's all about the power of the people. How will they come through this period of intense change, of intense transition? And really, it's the origins of the France that we see today. The France that, is still a republic, the France that has the Marseillaise, which is the national anthem, but it also has its roots very much in the French Revolution. And for that reason, I think it's a very interesting and important course for you to understand. So, how will you be assessed? Well, the value of this course, albeit it's really exciting and interesting, and I think perhaps one of the most interesting things that we do, it's actually worth 15%. So it's quite a small portion of your course, although there's still a lot to learn in it. So it's examined by quite a short exam, and it's examined by two types of question. Now the questions are divided into two pairs, so you choose either one pair of questions or the other, and it is set up so that you have to do one question from the Napoleonic period and one question from the revolutionary period. So there were two types of question within that. So if, for example, on pair 1 you do the revolutionary question as your first question, the second longer question will be on Napoleon. If you choose the second pair, the shorter question may be on Napoleon, but the longer will be on the French Revolution. So you'd get an element of choice, but you have to choose one complete pair. So what are they made up of? So the first question in that set of two is a short question by A-level standards, and it gives you a couple of things that you have to explain. It's worth 10 marks, and it gives you a couple of things that you're asked to explain. So for example, you might be asked to explain 2 key events, or you may be asked to explain 2 reasons why something happened. But either way, it's quite a short question. It's the shortest question that you will actually be asked on the A-level paper. The second of the pair is the longer question. This is a much more traditional A-level style question. It's a 20-mark question, and it will ask you for to do an analysis in depth. So it may, for example, ask you to assess the main reasons why Louis XVI lost control of France. It may ask you, for example, the most significant factor in Napoleon Bonaparte's downfall. That's the kind of question you might get on that one. As I said, it's a more traditional question. So everybody will have to do questions from both sides of that course, but you get a choice between 2 pairs of questions. So I hope that's clear.